Hello, I'm Michael Dowd, and this is part 4 of 5 in a video discussion series called God in Big History. And this particular session is called Sin and Death, and it'll be about 35 minutes long. This is the beta version, so I'm inviting feedback. This won't be professionally edited in the same way that the final version that I'll upload in September will be. So I invite any suggestions for improvement on any aspect of this program or any of these video series. Just to recap what we've covered, in the first volume, which was about 35 minutes long, we covered what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. And I outlined 7 unique characteristics of this globally produced, evidence-based creation story, cosmology. In volume 2, which was titled The Sacred Side of Science, or just Sacred Science, what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. In the third volume, we took a look at what and where God is in big history and why it matters. And in this session, we'll take a look at how does big history transform our understanding of human nature and death. In other words, what does our best science tell us about human nature and our own mortality in a way that's inspiring? And again, as I've mentioned previously, this TEDx talk that I did just in May, Reality Reconciles Science and Religion, is really an introduction to this whole series. But the TEDx talk that I did 2 years ago, also in Grand Rapids, called Why We Struggle Now, is the one that specifically deals with the evolutionary psychology and brain science that I'll be covering in the first part of this video. I'd like to start with a quote from David Sloan Wilson, one of the world's leading evolutionary theorists. He says, "Our unique human attributes evolved over a period of roughly 6 million years. They represent modifications of great ape attributes that are roughly 10 million years old, and mammalian attributes that are roughly 245 million years old. We also harbor vertebrate attributes that are roughly 600 million years old, and attributes of nucleated cells that are perhaps 1.5 billion years old. If you think it's unnecessary to go that far back in the tree of life to understand our own attributes, consider the humbling fact that we share with nematode worms the same gene that controls appetite. At most, our unique attributes are like an addition to a vast multi-room mansion. It is sheer hubris to think that we can ignore all but the newest rooms." And by the way, I'll go ahead and mention now that all of the background photos, other than the few galaxy shots that I occasionally use, that we of course gotten from NASA, but all the other background photos Connie has taken, my wife, Connie Barlow, as we've been traveling North America these last 12 years. So why we struggle and suffer? Well, most of us are aware that the reason we're tempted, the reason we struggle, the reason that we suffer, the reason that we become easily addicted, we and our kids and our grandkids, is not because our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple. We struggle and suffer because we have instincts that are just as compelling as any animal's instincts, and yet our instincts are mismatched for today's conditions. And we live in a world of supernormal allurements. So I recommend that you remember these two terms, mismatched instincts and supernormal allurements. Understanding the fact that our deepest drives, our deepest, most compelling instincts are radically mismatched for today's conditions. In other words, our instincts evolved to help us survive and reproduce in a world prior to the agricultural revolution, for 98% or 99% of human history. And yet every year since the agricultural revolution, since we domesticated plants and animals and began settling down rather than being hunter-gatherers and foragers, every year since then our instincts have been further and further mismatched for today's conditions. And understanding that mismatch can go a long way towards helping us to understand some of the things that we find challenging and problematic about ourselves and our loved ones. Now, supernormal allurements. Deirdre Barrett, a few years ago, wrote a book called Supernormal Stimuli. She's at Harvard University. How primal urges overran their evolutionary purpose. Fabulous book. I highly recommend it. Because in case it's not obvious, this isn't food. You'll never find anything like this in the natural world. This is a concentration of food-like items prepared in a way that we are evolutionarily programmed to pay attention to and to want more of. In fact, Deirdre Barrett says almost everyone will overeat if dining on supernormal stimuli. For example, they've taken birds' eggs. You can do this with many different species. And if you replace the normal egg with a ceramic egg or a wooden egg, but if just a little bit bigger, a little bit brighter, a little bit more pronounced markings, the bird will always sit on the fake egg. It'll ignore its own eggs. Its own eggs will die. And it will do this season after season after season. It will never learn. This is supernormal stimuli, supernormal allurement. Bees will become addicted to cocaine. Roundworms will become addicted to nicotine. I love this quote from Deirdre Barrett. She says, "The most dangerous aspect of our modern diet arises from our ability to refine food. This is the link to drug, alcohol, and tobacco addictions. Coca doesn't give South American Indians health problems when they brew or chew it. No one's ruined his life eating poppy seeds. When grapes and grains were fermented lightly and occasionally, they presented a healthy pleasure, not a hazard. Salt, fat, sugar, and starch are not harmful in their natural contexts. It's our modern ability to concentrate things like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and food components that turns them into a menace that our bodies are hardwired to crave." I mean, think about it. What was there to be addicted to 10,000 years ago? I mean, were you going to run into some fermented berries? I mean, hard liquor wasn't even invented until 300 years ago. And yet today, we've got drugs, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, video games, shopping, internet porn, romance novels, news. And these are like the bigger egg. These are things that we waste our time and we sit on this stuff and spend our time and, our kids get addicted and we sometimes struggle because these are supernormal allurement. That is, they are concentrations of what we would normally be allured to, but now in almost an irresistible dose or an irresistible way. Several years ago, Newsweek magazine published their cover issue was "I Crazy: Panic, Depression, Psychosis, How Connectivity Addiction is Rewiring Our Brains." Now, I don't want to leave you with the bad news here. The good news, that is the gospel of, according to science, that is that we can finally honor reality. We can honor God. If you haven't watched the previous sessions, I use the word God and reality interchangeably. Reality, you could say, is God's secular name. God is reality's mythic name or a personal name. But these are interchangeable. And said another way, any use of the word God that doesn't include reality is trivial, impotent, and deserves to be rejected. We all have mismatched instincts. We all have our deepest drives. That is, we all have an unchosen nature. We have aspects of ourselves that we didn't choose. We were born this way for good reasons. For example, we all have cravings for sugar, salts, and fats. Now, why is that? Well, it's because for 99% of human history, it wasn't easy to find sugar, salts, and fats. So having a craving for those things allowed our ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce. Yet today, we're bombarded with foods that have sugar, salts, and fats. Yet we still have the cravings as though they're rare. It's a mismatched. None of us would be alive. Anybody listening to this or watching this, nobody would be alive if some of our ancestors weren't really, really good at putting on weight. That's what fat is. Fat is stored energy so that we can survive the harsh winters and the droughts and the lean times. Anybody that, couldn't put on fat and store energy that way got lost to the gene pool. And our ancestors were so generous, they passed those genes on to us. It's our unchosen nature. Testosterone. One of the things we know about testosterone, and we don't believe this, we know this is evidentially known, is that the higher the testosterone, the more people take risks and the more they think about sex. And this is true for men and women. It's a human universal. And see, what this does is it helps us understand some of the scandals that we've seen in the political and religious leaders and sports leaders. Because you can take a woman, for example, you can take somebody with very little testosterone, and you give them a testosterone patch, you give them testosterone supplements, and they're going to have sex on the brain. In fact, Connie and I stayed at the home of a couple out in Marin County, California, some years ago, and we were talking about this stuff, human nature and that sort of thing. And the wife confided in us, and she said that her doctor had put her on hormonal patches, testosterone, and she said within 2 days, she said, I couldn't stop thinking about sex. She said, is this what guys have to deal with? Well, yes, it is actually. Typically, men have 10 to 20 times the testosterone that women do. See, our instincts deceive us for good evolutionary reasons. Snakes don't talk. And when we understand this, by the way, this picture was taken with a friend out in California who had a pet snake, and Connie had to take this picture. But when we understand this, it gives us freedom. This is what reality has been revealing through evidence about why we struggle and suffer. Because, whatever you find tempting, whatever you find discouraging and overwhelming, we all know that, relationships can be difficult. And why is it that so many of our religious leaders fall victim to sexual scandal? Like, what's this about? Well, having an inadequate understanding of human nature is at the root of all of this. If these are the best terms that we have, ego, id, subconscious, sinful nature, shadow, inner demons, if this is the best we can do in terms of trying to describe what's going on under the hood, as it were, these are not adequate. Now, I'm not saying we should throw these away, but these terms need to be supplemented with language like mismatched instincts and supernormal allurements. And it's not just our personal issues. So many of our collective challenges have an inadequate understanding of human nature at their foundation. This is one of the reasons why Connie and I are so passionate about this evolutionary psychology and brain science. And I would argue that sending our teenagers out into the world without teaching them about mismatched instincts and supernormal allurements is like, sending them out 20,000 years ago without ever telling them about saber-toothed cats. It's just insane. It's crazy. Now, this perspective un-trivializes or factualizes ancient mythic insights, such as the fall of Adam and Eve and original sin. Prior to microscopes, before we could even see bacteria, before we even knew bacteria existed, it wasn't just difficult to understand infection. It was completely impossible to understand infection. Prior to telescopes, it wasn't just difficult to understand the structure of the universe. It was completely impossible. Well, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, it wasn't just difficult to understand our evolved brain. It was utterly impossible. And, if you were paying attention back then, you would know what we all know through personal experience, which is we all say, I'll do that, but we don't. We say, I'll never do that, but we do. We say, you can count on me for that, but they sure couldn't. What's that about? Well, the fall of Adam and Eve, original sin, are spot on, accurate night language about what we can now speak about in a natural, factual, day language way. Let me just tell you one story. I was doing a program in northern Florida, and there was an 82-year-old man who came up to me after the program, and he was practically vibrating. The guy was so excited. He said, Michael, I've got to tell you a story I've never told anybody. Well, I don't know about you, but when somebody who's 80 years old is going to tell me a story they've never told anybody, I'm all ears. So I was like, please tell me. He said, I had no idea until your sermon why my life began unraveling after I had a significant promotion 35 years ago. He said, I became the vice president of my corporation. He said, now I had been married for 13 years and I had never betrayed my wife. He said, but within 6 months of my promotion, he said, I had 5 affairs. None of them knew about each other. My wife didn't know about any of them. He said, it ultimately cost me my marriage. It cost me my job. And he said, I've been living with the guilt and the shame of this for 35 years. I haven't told anybody until I'm telling you right now. And could you imagine how free this guy must have felt? And he said, he told me, he said, it feels like I can let go of the boatloads of self-judgment and guilt and clean up things. And to his credit, he did. Between Sunday morning, which is when I did the sermon, and Tuesday night, which is when I did the evening program, he called his ex-wife. He said, I hadn't talked to her in 9 years. He said, I apologize for being such a deceptive, lying sack, came back into integrity. To use Christian language, he came back to Christ. He came back to integrity, incarnate, integrity personified. And I found out 3 months later from his roommate that his depression of the last 15 years had lifted. He wasn't even on the medication anymore. Now, he wasn't a Christian. He was a humanist. This was a Unitarian Universalist church. But he said, it feels like I've got a new lease on life. He says, it feels like I've had a born-again experience. And here I am, 82 years old. In fact, the New York Times Magazine, when it did a feature article on my book about 5 years ago, interviewed this guy. I've used this image before. Here's a quote from the Apostle Paul, who said it perhaps best. He said, "I'm a slave to sin. I really don't understand myself. I have the desire to do what is good, but I don't do it. What I end up doing is not the good I want to do, but what I hate to do. What a wretched man am I." I believe that history will show that the greatest psychological and spiritual revelation or realization, however you want to talk about it, of the 20th century was the discovery that human beings have powerful, indeed compelling instincts, just like all other animals do. And if we don't understand, appreciate, and respectfully manage, that is, honor and harness our inherited drives, we are bound to be enslaved to them. And this is where the emotional and practical benefits of an evolutionary worldview come blazingly into focus. I mean, some people think that evolution is just about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. In fact, after my TEDx talk that I gave a couple of years ago, I had 3 evangelicals come up to me independently within a 2.5-hour period after my program. And all 3 of them said basically the same thing, which was, I was a young earth creationist until I heard your presentation. Now I've got to accept evolution, but I just got to do it in a God-honoring way. In fact, one young man, he was probably 20, 25 years old, he said, I always thought that evolution was about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to live a more Christ-like life, how to have healthier relationships. So this is the emotional and practical benefits, is that we can have gratitude for what we've inherited. See, the original story, the Genesis story, doesn't get you to gratitude in the way that what God's been revealing, what reality is revealing through evidence does. Because here's the thing. If your ancestors didn't have the very same instincts that you and your loved ones sometimes find challenging, y'all wouldn't even be alive. I mean, get that. Let that in. If your ancestors didn't have these same compelling urges, these drives, you wouldn't even be alive. And having that sense of gratitude and appreciation can significantly help us move beyond denial, guilt, and resentment. Because rather than feeling guilty, it's like, well, of course, we're this way. And of course, we're tempted in these ways. And having that, of course, sort of stance, emotional stance, allows us to move beyond shame and blame. We can have compassion for self and others in ways that are, frankly, very difficult without this perspective. In fact, there was a biologist that came up to Connie 7 or 8 years ago, and she said, I just got my doctorate in neurobiology. And she said, the more I learn about how the brain works, she said, the more compassion that I have for myself and others. She said, isn't it amazing and somewhat ironic that science is giving us access to this traditional spiritual virtue? We can healing broken relationships becomes almost a no-brainer when you get this evolutionary psychology and brain science perspective. We can develop a witness capacity that's not the same as sitting on a cushion meditating a witness. It's having an evolutionary witness for understanding what's driving us and why, what's going on under the hood. Because, without this understanding, we're sort of just guessing. It's like you imagine you've got a really great car that, is just limping along and, you've never opened up the hood. You don't know anything about the internal combustion engine. You're just making up stories about what might be wrong. It's the homunculus, or it's its inner demons or whatever. No, we now know what's going on and why. So, again, this is just a quick and dirty introduction. If you want more on this, Connie and I have developed many programs based on evolutionary psychology and brain science. If you just Google evolutionize your life, or also you can Google your brain's creation story. You'll get just all kinds of great stuff up online. And then 2 main websites that deal with this, thegreatstory.org and michaeldowd.org. You'll find tons of great stuff on evolutionary psychology and brain science. What big history reveals about human nature and death. So let's now move to talking about death and chaos. Big history transforms our relationship to problems and challenges of all kinds, as well as our mortality. And so this is why I want to just very briefly talk about the gifts of chaos and death in an evolving cosmos. In other words, what does big history, that is the science-based global collective intelligence of the history of everyone and everything, physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution as our common creation story, what does it tell us about chaos and death that can be deeply inspiring? Well, in terms of chaos, I showed in a previous session my great story beads, or cosmic rosary. I've got a 15-foot chain of beads where each bead signifies some significant event in the universe story or big history or epic of evolution. And I've got the major catastrophes. I've got the major violent, chaotic, destructive episodes, because one of the most significant, in fact, I would argue the most significant factor in bringing about new creative transformation and evolutionary emergence is chaos, breakdowns, and bad news. I mean, nothing is more important. And when we get that, when we understand that's true for billions of years, we recognize a couple of things. One is that death and resurrection isn't merely about one God-man 2,000 years ago, that is mythically pointing to something fundamentally true about the nature of nature for billions of years. And understanding that, getting that, letting that into my heart and gut, allows me to trust the chaos of my life, the chaos of our times, the chaos of our culture. I mean, sometimes people will ask me, Michael, you sound so hopeful, and yet you're clearly aware of the big challenges facing us. How can you stay hopeful? And I say, I have faith in our stupidity. I mean, I have faith in chaos. I have faith in the breakdowns. Now, in terms of death, mortality, we now know, this has been revealed by God, by reality, through evidence. This is evidential revelation. The Apostle Paul didn't know this. Moses didn't know this. The Buddha didn't know this. Jesus didn't know this. Muhammad didn't know this. We now know, we don't believe, that mountains die, oceans die, continents die. And thank God they do. Without the death of species, there'd be no complex life beyond pond scum. Now, I've got nothing against pond scum, but when you compare it to the world we actually live in, this incredibly majestic world is possible only because of the death, not just of individuals, but entire species. More than 99% of the species that have ever existed on planet Earth are not here now. Now, this doesn't mean that Connie and I aren't profoundly committed to biodiversity and to protecting as much of the biodiversity of this planet as possible, but we also recognize that evolution has come this way and come to this point because of the death of species. Without the death of fetal cells in the embryonic stage of development, we'd all be spheres. I mean, the reason we have shape is because cells died in between the places of our fingers. I mean, we'd all be spheres if that was not the case. Without the death of plants and animals, there would be no food. I mean, this is clearly obvious when we think about it, but we're not used to thinking about the positive role of death in the universe. Without the death of stars, there would be no periodic table of elements, no planets, no life. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about this a lot. Others do too, that we are stardust. Carl Sagan said this. We are stardust, now evolved to the place that the stardust can think about itself. Without the death of elders, there would be no room for children. I mean, think about it. In a finite world, if all you got is birth with no death, very quickly you're wall-to-wall people, wall-to-wall skunks, wall-to-wall bacteria, 60 feet deep. It doesn't take long. Death is essential on a finite planet, absolutely essential. So what we've now come to through evidential knowledge, what God, reality has been revealing through evidence, we now know that death is natural and necessary at every level of reality, and thus death is no less sacred than life. Honoring mortality, honoring death, again, this is the question. Do we have an honorable or a dishonorable relationship to reality, to time, nature, mystery? Do we have an honorable relationship to these realities? Or do we have a dishonorable relationship? Well, honoring mortality and death can help us cherish life and leave a sweet legacy. All the world's religious traditions speak about having death as your advisor, having your own mortality as a spiritual guide, because you don't take your life for granted when you realize that you're mortal and you keep that awareness ever present there for you. And this isn't just an academic exercise. This was me 4 years ago. I went through a very serious bout of cancer. I had a tumor the size of my fist in my spleen. I had diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I went through 6 rounds of R-CHOP chemotherapy and then had my spleen removed. And even when we were looking at the possibility that I could die in the next 6 months to a year, and there was a period before the chemotherapy started working where that was a possibility, I had what religious people call the peace that passes understanding. And it wasn't because I was holding out hope for pearly gates and mansions when I die. I'm a Christian naturalist. I'm a religious naturalist. I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs at all. I honor those who do, but that's not my worldview. I'm a sacred realist. Factual faith is what I evangelize. Big history is what I evangelize. It seems to me as a religious naturalist, as a Christian naturalist, that it seems to me pretty clear that where we go to when we die is the same place we came from before we were born. And whether you speak of that as coming from God and returning to God, or coming from mystery and returning to mystery, or coming from nothing and returning to nothing, I think all those are legitimate ways of talking about it. But as I sometimes say, as I often say in my evening programs, not just humorously, if where I go to when I die isn't the very same place that all other plants and animals and bacteria have gone, I'm going to be pissed. I don't think there's some special place that I go to. We all return to reality, to God. Now, a few years ago, David Brooks at the New York Times wrote a very potent op-ed piece, column on death and budgets. And he said, "We think the budget mess is a squabble between partisans in Washington, but in large measure, it's about our inability to face death and our willingness as a nation to spend whatever it takes to push it just slightly over the horizon." I mean, this brings up the whole notion of supernormal medical technologies. Our ancestors never had to say no to some of the things that we have to say no to ahead of time. Otherwise, many of us are going to die like this guy. The last months of our lives can be hooked up to all this kinds of, technology that can keep the organs of our bodies alive with no concern whatsoever to the cost to the next generations, to the cost to society. In fact, what we now know is that many of us, by experiencing this, our loved ones or our family members, we now seeing a level of physical suffering, emotional distress, family discord, and again, the societal cost. We are bankrupting future generations. I mean, imagine this guy here. He's, in his young 80s, it looks like. Imagine that he had a great legacy. And then in the last 7 months of his life, he was kept alive like this at the cost of 46 college educations. What's his net legacy? It's really mixed. Until we grasp that death plays a vital and necessary role in an evolving cosmos, Christianity will continue to be shackled by unnatural, otherworldly notions of the gospel, as if the great news, the gospel, was merely cosmic fire insurance. Medical technologies will continue to prolong physical and emotional suffering and provoke family discord. The medical industry will continue to underwrite the widening gap between the rich and the poor. And perhaps most tragically of all, seniors and their families will continue to be seduced into perhaps the greatest generational injustice and legacy diminishing evil in history. So again, this is just a brief introduction. If you want to know more, Connie and I have developed a lot of stuff on this topic. So just Google Death Through Deep Time Eyes or Dowd Barlow Death Programs, and you'll find all kinds of great stuff. And a video that we highly recommend is Griefwalker. It was put out by the Canadian Film Board. It's on Stephen Jenkinson. It's sort of a documentary on him, but it's a wonderfully done film. It's just the cinematography is incredible. I love this quote: "Not success, not growth, not happiness. The cradle of your love of life is death." I highly recommend this video. And it's available for free. You can get the DVD so you can loan it to others, which I've done. But also you can watch the entire thing for free up online. So what we've seen is that big history radically transforms our understanding and our experience of human nature, chaos, and death. So again, just to recap, in session 1 on the big picture, we covered what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. In the second volume, we took a look, which is called Sacred Science. We took a look at what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, as well as how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. In the third session, we took a look at what and where God is in big history and why it matters. And in this one, we took a look at how big history transforms our understanding and experience of our own nature, human nature, and death and chaos. In the final episode, we'll take a look at how does a factual understanding of God and revelation clarify our way into the future and call forth boldly pro-science prophetic speech. Those of you who are leading study groups, these are questions that I've developed. I encourage you to wait till September for the final version. But if you have any suggestions for improvement of any of these questions that you would use in a study group and that sort of thing, please, by all means, offer them to me. In fact, if you have any suggestions for improvement of any aspect of this video series, I welcome your feedback. And I will be available beginning in September for Skype, conference call, or speakerphone, where I can respond to questions and comments and that sort of thing. There's my contact information.